The Windsor Gala was supposed to be a flawless display of royal unity. Instead, it ended before the first formal toast. King Charles had been walking toward the grand reception hall when he noticed three familiar figures standing behind the curtained backstage entrance members of Queen Camilla's private circle, who had never been cleared to attend. His expression changed instantly. Seconds later, the king raised one hand and issued an order nobody in the palace expected: cancel everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stopped so sharply that the Lord Chamberlain nearly walked into him. The Lord Chamberlain, the royal official responsible for ceremonies, followed the monarch's stare toward the restricted corridor. The Windsor Gala had been designed to unite royals, diplomats, charity leaders, and household figures, proving that the crown remained steady after weeks of tension over access, influence, and private loyalties. The king did not look confused. He looked wounded. One of the three figures held a cream invitation marked with the royal household crest. Yet none of their names appeared on the final security list Charles had approved. That list controlled who could move beyond the public rooms into private working areas. Someone had not merely bent the rules. Someone inside Windsor had opened a protected door. Charles turned to the Lord Chamberlain and spoke without raising his voice. The gala will not proceed. Conversations broke apart. The orchestra fell silent. Staff froze beside the ballroom entrance as the monarch ordered the backstage corridor sealed and instructed security not to let the three visitors leave until their invitations had been examined. Camilla received the news from an aide and stared at him in disbelief. The queen consort knew those people well. They had stood beside her for years, and she could not understand why their presence had caused such a collapse. Yet when the aide mentioned the unlisted invitation, her disbelief shifted into fear. William watched his father and saw something more dangerous than anger. The prince recognized betrayal in the older man's face. Charles refused to confront the group publicly because one careless exchange could allow everyone involved to agree on the same explanation. Instead, he demanded the invitation, the access log, and every recorded security call connected to the corridor. Camilla removed her gloves and walked toward the king's private chamber. William stepped aside, but he did not look away. The gala had been cancelled in less than a minute, but behind the sealed doors of Windsor, the real question was no longer who had entered backstage, but who had given them permission. To the guests waiting in the ballroom, the cancellation looked sudden. To the people closest to the crown, it was the breaking point in a conflict that had been building for months. Charles saw a breach of trust. Camilla saw an attack on the people who had supported her before she ever wore a crown. William saw a threat to royal authority, and standing between them was a private circle whose presence had become more powerful than anyone had openly admitted. Charles stood alone beside a small table, loosening one cufflink while staring at the unauthorized invitation. Windsor was not merely another royal residence. It was a working center of the monarchy, where invitations, security routes, and private movements carried the weight of the king's authority. Every approved name signaled trust. Every restricted corridor protected not just a family, but an institution expected to remain controlled under pressure. The king said nothing. His silence revealed something deeper than anger. The invitation in his hand suggested that someone had used the royal household crest without passing through his office, creating a separate path into Windsor. That possibility wounded him because it meant his authority had not been challenged from outside. It had been bypassed by people close enough to understand exactly what they were doing. Camilla entered an adjoining sitting room and placed her handbag on a chair. The queen consort asked her private secretary which names Charles had seen and whether all three had been stopped. Her voice remained steady, but humiliation pressed beneath every word. These were not casual acquaintances. They were advisors, social confidants, and unofficial intermediaries. who had known her before her royal position, gave her a formal role within the monarchy. The private secretary answered carefully. One individual had recently requested access to event schedules, seating changes, and guest movements without contacting the king's office. Another had appeared at 2 earlier royal engagements, despite being missing from the official access lists. Camilla's expression changed. Windsor was no longer an isolated mistake. A pattern had been hiding behind familiar faces. William found Catherine away from the waiting guests and chose his words with care. The prince said his father appeared betrayed, not surprised. That distinction unsettled the princess, because it suggested Charles had already feared that Camilla's circle was building influence beyond ordinary friendship. Catherine remembered a reception several weeks earlier. William had confronted the same advisor after confidential arrangements were discussed outside the palace, and Camilla had defended that person without hesitation. The exchange had ended quietly, but the damage had remained. The faces backstage were only the visible part of the crisis. The true beginning lay in an earlier ceremony, where one quiet exchange changed the balance of trust forever. Every royal rupture has a point of no return. For Charles and Camilla, it came 6 weeks before the Windsor Gala, during a private reception at Clarence House. What began as a minor disagreement over guest access became a direct challenge to the king's authority. A member of Camilla's circle entered a restricted briefing room, spoke as though royal approval had already been granted, and forced William to ask the question everyone else had avoided. Who was truly controlling the Queen's private network? Tension had already been growing. Camilla relied more heavily on informal advisors to manage personal appearances, charitable introductions, and social relationships around official events. Clarence House, the royal residence where much of the king and queen's private work was handled, had become the meeting point between personal loyalty and public duty. Charles tolerated that arrangement because several members of the circle had supported her through painful years and earned a place in her trust. The decisive moment came during that private reception. Camilla's senior confidant entered a restricted planning room and told staff to add 3 names to the Windsor Gala's backstage access list before Charles had approved the change. The backstage list was the final record, controlling who could enter private working areas beyond the public reception rooms. Altering it without permission was not a social favor. It was a challenge to command. William walked in before the papers were removed. The prince saw handwritten names beside the sealed guest schedule and asked who had authorized them. The confidant did not hesitate. "Her Majesty is already aware," she replied, using the Queen's title as though the decision had already been settled. Yet Camilla had signed nothing, and no formal instruction had reached the king's office. William heard pressure in those words. The future king believed staff were being pushed to obey because refusing might appear disrespectful to Camilla. She saw the confrontation differently. When the queen learned what had happened, she accused him of humiliating a woman who had served her faithfully for years. Charles met his wife privately that evening and asked her to keep personal friends away from official planning. The king spoke calmly, but the warning was clear. Camilla refused to abandon them. She argued that the institution welcomed their loyalty in difficult moments, then treated their presence as inconvenient when appearances mattered. Charles ordered the added names removed. Someone restored them days later through another household channel. A junior aide preserved both schedules after noticing an authorization code from an office with no proper reason to approve backstage entry. On gala night, that aide carried both versions into the king's chamber. With the 2 schedules placed side by side, Charles no longer needed to ask whether his order had been ignored. He needed to ask whether his wife had allowed it. The most explosive moment of the night did not happen in the ballroom. It unfolded in a private chamber, where no guests, cameras, or musicians could soften the truth. Charles stood beside the cancelled gala schedule. Camilla entered without an aide. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the king pushed the unauthorized invitation across the table, and demanded to know why people from her private circle had been positioned backstage after he had personally ordered their names removed. Charles had placed 3 items before him: the original schedule, the amended access list, and the invitation carrying the royal household crest. The access list was the official record controlling who could enter restricted areas during the event. Together, those papers turned suspicion into evidence. Camilla had entered believing the cancellation was an excessive response to a manageable mistake. One glance at the documents told her this was something far more serious. The king leaned forward. "Did you know they were coming?" he asked. Camilla reached for a chair, pulled it back, then remained standing. The queen consort said she knew they had been invited to Windsor, but she had not known they would be placed backstage. Charles did not answer immediately. His silence made the room feel smaller. Camilla defended the people around her. She said his household had treated her trusted friends as embarrassing outsiders, even though those same individuals had supported her through years when royal doors remained closed. Charles rejected that argument. The king said friendship was not the issue. The issue was the use of royal channels without consent, and the deliberate restoration of names he had personally removed. The queen's expression hardened. She heard more than an accusation about procedure. She heard judgment on the life she had lived before the crown, and on the people who had stood beside her when acceptance seemed impossible. Charles saw that pain, but he did not retreat. The monarchy could survive discomfort. It could not survive private networks acting in its name. Camilla finally admitted the truth. Through a recorded conversation with one advisor earlier that week, she had asked that person to remain nearby because she feared the king's office planned to announce changes to her public role without consulting her. Charles stared at her in disbelief. No such announcement existed. The king understood at once. Someone had fed Camilla false information, made her feel threatened, and used that fear to justify bringing allies backstage. When she reached for the invitation, he covered it with his hand. "It stays with my office," he said. Charles summoned William. The confrontation had exposed fear on both sides, but when the prince entered, the crisis shifted from a private marital wound into a struggle over who still controlled the monarchy. Canceling the gala was Charles's decision, but the authority behind that decision rested on something larger than anger. The king controlled Windsor's household, its security clearances, and the final approval over who could enter restricted royal spaces. Yet the amended list proved that his command had been bypassed from within. As William examined the authorization trail, he discovered that the breach had not come through Camilla's private office alone. Someone in the king's own structure had opened the door. William sat at his father's desk and read the access log twice before setting down his pen. The authorization trail was the recorded chain showing which office approved each guest and security movement. Final access had been divided between the king's household, Windsor security, event staff, and the queen's private team. That system worked only because delegated codes and spoken instructions were trusted. One dishonest approval could move a person through several protected doors without attracting immediate suspicion. The prince felt anger rise when he recognized the code. It belonged to an office that had served Charles for years and was expected to protect his final authority. William told the king to suspend every delegated access privilege connected to the gala until each decision could be traced to a named individual. No title, friendship, or long service could be allowed to hide responsibility. Camilla's private secretary objected at once. The secretary warned that freezing every privilege linked to her team would isolate the queen and make her appear guilty before the inquiry was complete. Camilla heard the protest from the adjoining room and remained silent. She knew the suspension would weaken her household, but she also knew the altered list could no longer be explained as a harmless mistake. Charles listened without moving. The king understood that royal events depended on quiet cooperation, yet that same trust had been turned against him. William then found the deeper connection. A trusted intermediary had been communicating separately with Camilla's circle and a senior member of the monarch's event staff. The intermediary had sent the false warning about changes to the Queen's public role. According to the preserved message record, the goal was to bring her allies backstage, where they could pressure palace officials before the gala began. The meeting would force a private negotiation inside Windsor before Charles could stop it. The king removed his signet ring, the personal seal used as a symbol of royal approval, and placed it beside the access list. He ordered the intermediary's credentials cancelled before sunrise. Personal trust had ended. Before security completed the order, one final message reached Camilla's closest confidant. The king intended to dismantle the entire circle. By midnight, the palace had identified the person who opened the door, but the first consequences would fall on those Camilla had fought hardest to protect. The cancellation lasted one evening. The consequences began before dawn. Security passes were deactivated, private entrances were reassigned, and members of Camilla's circle received instructions not to return to Windsor without written approval from the king's office. For Charles, the restrictions were necessary. For Camilla, they felt like the destruction of a support system built over decades. As the last car left the castle grounds, the Queen understood that the gala had cost her far more than one public appearance. Camilla stood at the window as one confidant's vehicle disappeared beyond Windsor. The Queen consort pressed her fingertips against the glass, then turned away before her private secretary could see the tears rising. Suspended credentials meant old security permissions had been cancelled. Frozen invitations meant every future appearance connected to her advisors would now require fresh approval. The palace was not simply correcting a mistake. It was cutting her private circle away from royal life. Charles received confirmation that the passes had been disabled and closed his eyes for a moment. The king felt relief, because the breach had been contained, yet guilt followed quickly. Guests had been told the gala ended because of an internal security concern, a controlled explanation designed to protect the monarchy while the investigation continued. That statement shielded Camilla publicly, but it could not protect her from what had happened privately. The Queen refused breakfast with her husband. She sent word through her secretary that she would not attend the next morning's joint engagement unless her role was formally clarified. Charles understood the warning. Camilla feared that the restrictions were only the first step toward reducing her influence, and silence would allow that fear to grow. William remained firm. The prince told Catherine that emotional loyalty could never override controlled access, because one unchecked exception could weaken every future security decision. The princess agreed with the principle, but challenged the method. She warned that humiliating Camilla completely might turn pain into defiance and deepen the fracture Charles was trying to close. The dismissed intermediary then broke silence through a recorded interview with palace investigators. He admitted that the false warning came from a draft discussion about reorganizing royal duties. The proposal never removed Camilla's status, title, or public work. Her circle had exaggerated it into an immediate threat, because they feared losing influence, as William assumed greater operational responsibility. Catherine understood what had to happen next. She asked to speak privately with Camilla, believing the truth must come from another woman rather than through Charles's authority or William's investigation. The palace had imposed its punishment, but the emotional turning point would come in a quiet room where Catherine and Camilla faced each other without aides, files, or royal protection. There were no secretaries in the room when Catherine met Camilla the following afternoon. No schedules, no household officials, no one to translate emotion into protocol. The Queen sat beside an untouched cup of tea, visibly exhausted from the night before. Catherine closed the door herself and took the chair opposite her. What followed was not a negotiation over access. It was a conversation about fear, belonging, and the cost of depending on people who profit from keeping old wounds alive. Catherine had asked for the meeting because she believed Camilla had been manipulated. Advisors around the Queen consort had turned William's growing role into something darker. presenting ordinary restructuring as a personal campaign against her. The proposed central office simply meant that one team would control event planning, approvals, and security across the household. It did not remove her title, public position, or charitable work. Camilla listened without interrupting. The Queen agreed to meet because Catherine had not taken part in the Access investigation and could speak without sounding like an extension of Charles's authority. That distance mattered. She needed to hear the truth from someone who understood the pressure of royal life, but was not carrying the anger of the king, or the suspicion of the future king. Catherine spoke carefully. The princess explained that no one intended to make Camilla invisible. The changes were designed to stop rival offices from issuing conflicting instructions. Yet the Queen admitted that she had imagined something far worse. She feared becoming ceremonial and isolated, surrounded by staff loyal to Charles and William, while no one remained loyal to her. Camilla's voice lowered as she described that fear. She had spent years fighting to belong, and the thought of losing influence felt like being pushed back toward the edge. Catherine did not dismiss that pain. She answered with something harder. Loyalty was not proven by helping someone avoid rules. True loyalty would have protected her from the humiliation that exploded at Windsor. The Queen finally revealed the hidden instruction through her private account of the conversation. Her closest confidant had urged her not to tell Charles about the backstage invitations because direct approval would probably be refused. That advice had sounded protective at the time. Now it sounded calculated. Camilla reached into her handbag and removed a handwritten contact card. She tore it in half and told Catherine that the people involved would never again speak in her name. In that moment, she accepted the truth. Some members of the circle had been defending their own access, influence, and closeness to royal power. The Queen then decided to meet Charles and support the restrictions publicly. Before standing, she asked Catherine to remain nearby. She feared her husband might no longer believe her. For the first time since the gala collapsed, Camilla was ready to stop defending the circle, but the monarchy still had to explain why Windsor's doors had closed before the entire world. By sunrise, the cancelled gala was no longer a private royal crisis. It had become the defining image of the morning. Outside Windsor Castle, cameras faced the gates as guests' abandoned arrival barriers were removed. Broadcasters repeated the same question. What could force a king to cancel one of his own major events within minutes of entering the building? Then a newspaper appeared with a front page that transformed palace tension into a national symbol. An empty ballroom beneath the words, "The night the king said no." The palace moved quickly. A controlled statement confirmed that unauthorized individuals had entered a restricted operational area, meaning a private zone used by staff, security, and senior royals during official events. The wording avoided Camilla's name and made no mention of her circle. Yet the silence around those details only deepened public suspicion. A cancelled royal gala was rare. A cancellation caused by people already inside Windsor suggested a failure of trust at the heart of the household. Crowds gathered near the castle as staff removed the gold arrival ropes left from the previous night. One woman placed a small Union flag against the barrier and said Charles had been right to protect the institution. Others were less certain. They argued that the Queen had been publicly humiliated because people she trusted had used her fear to secure influence. A breakfast broadcaster intensified the debate. The program displayed Charles arriving solemnly beside an image of the empty gala entrance. The presenter called the crisis a test of whether private influence can cross a royal boundary. That phrase spread quickly because it captured the question now facing the monarchy. Could personal loyalty ever be allowed to override royal authority? William watched the coverage in silence beside Catherine. The prince finally said Camilla could not be allowed to carry the entire blame for a system others had manipulated. The princess agreed. She reminded him that accountability would mean little if the palace protected its own staff while allowing the Queen to absorb every public consequence. Charles reached the same conclusion. The king approved a second written statement, confirming that an internal staff credential had been misused. The clarification mattered, because it showed the breach extended beyond Camilla's friendships and into his own structure. Camilla entered his office while the wording was being finalized. The queen consort asked that her name not be protected through deception. She would accept the restrictions publicly, but she would not allow Charles to hide her mistakes behind vague language. The king looked at her, then set the prepared statement aside. He chose a joint decision instead. The world had seen an empty ballroom and a divided palace. Now Charles and Camilla had one final chance to decide what that cancelled night would ultimately mean. The Windsor Gala never resumed. There was no replacement date, no attempt to recreate the evening, and no quiet restoration of the people removed backstage. Instead, Charles and Camilla made a final decision together. The unauthorized circle would lose all informal access to royal planning. The compromised staff channel would be permanently closed, and every future invitation would require named approval. Yet the most important outcome was not written into protocol. It was the moment husband and wife chose honesty over the influence surrounding them. Charles confirmed that the gala would not be rescheduled. The king understood that reviving it would weaken the meaning of his decision and suggest the breach had been temporary. A new access structure placed Windsor events under one accountable chain, linking his office, security officials, and approved representatives from Camilla's household. That chain meant every instruction would lead back to a named person, leaving no room for hidden pressure or borrowed authority. The monarch read the final order aloud in his private office. When he finished, he set the document down and admitted that canceling the gala had been painful but necessary. Camilla listened without interruption. The queen consort said defending her circle, after the truth emerged, would have damaged both the crown and their marriage. She accepted that personal trust had been allowed to become official influence. Charles did not demand an apology for every argument that had led them there. He asked for one promise. Neither of them would again allow advisors to carry messages that should pass directly between husband and wife. For Camilla agreed. She then dismissed the confidant who had concealed the backstage plan, proving that her final loyalty rested with the monarchy rather than the network that had surrounded her. The consequences remained permanent. The staff member who misused the authorization code was removed from royal event planning. The intermediary's credentials stayed cancelled, with no path back into Windsor. Friendship had once opened doors. Now accountability closed them. Charles and Camilla entered the empty gala hall together. The king paused where he had issued the cancellation. The queen took his arm, and they walked out side by side. The cancellation had not destroyed their partnership. It had drawn the painful boundary that saved it. Charles proved the crown could not be governed by private circles. Camilla proved she could surrender influence that threatened the institution she had fought to join. Windsor emerged stricter, scarred, and united. The message was final. Friendship may stand near the crown, but it will never again act in its name. The Windsor Gala ended before it began, yet its cancellation forced the king, the queen, and the monarchy itself to choose trust, accountability, and unity over unchecked influence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.